Jeri Shepherd, Reggie LeBurge, and Maggie McMahon. I am a 31 starting this year, writing and publishing veteran. I'm a cross-genre writer, everything from sports writing, nonfiction, biography, leadership, to kids' books, plays, and in the last coming up on 5 years, I've been in the genre fiction and game writing world. And yeah, that's who I am. So go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jeff Grubb, game designer and author. I build worlds for a living. Basically, involved in the creation of the Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance, as well as pushing Spelljammer, Al-Qadim. I've worked with licenses like Marvel Superheroes, Buck Rogers over the years. I've written novels, comic books, a lot of game product. Currently, I am a senior writer for the Elder Scrolls Online game from ZeniMax. So I write for computer games now. Was involved also in helping shape and create Guild Wars 2 way back in the day.
I'm Chris. I write books that nerds like. I have been for the last years, probably almost 20 years, really doing a lot of novels. I've really transitioned into a lot of game writing stuff over the last several years. I've written some stuff in Firefly for Guild Force 9. I've written some stuff in Shadowrun and a couple of other IPs that I work in as well.
Okay. So I'm going to start at the really top level, because this one is called, it's really about creating lore and whether it's for TCGs, whether it's for other games. So let's just define that word. So I'm gonna let you start us off, Jeff.
Throw me in the deep end.
We're
okay.
That's the deep end. No, stop. So let's, what does that word even mean?
Lore tends to be background. It tends to be history. It tends to be legend, often for fantasy projects. And what it provides is a grounding and a foundation for the world and your actions you're taking within the world. If you're in a heroic world, you basically are looking at the tales and legends of the past. If you're working in a cozy type situation, you want to reinforce those core concepts of the game, of the world itself. And those core concepts from the game or novel or whatever, or IP, basically form a foundation of which you're going to base your world on. The idea is to create a truth for the players as they interact with the card game or the role-playing game. Did a lot of Magic stuff. Brothers War, when back in the day, was based on, for example, the Antiquities set, and took the whole amount of the set and basically codified it into a coherent storyline all the way through. And what this does from selling the games angle is it creates a stickiness, it creates an adherence, it creates a reality that players want to interact with, not just for the mechanics of the game or the challenge of the game, but also for the background and the feeling of who are you and what you are doing within that game.
He's like, throw me in the deep end, and he literally gives like the perfect encyclopedia entry on the definition and example of lore.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Okay, we're done.
No, that's great. Have a good day. Thanks for attending GaryCon. We're good.
Sometimes lore also can help establish mechanics.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I like to do, I love to, when you just kind of drawing up some of the maps, especially if it's a fantasy world, I know, and I'll be curious to find out what do you like to start with if you're looking at a map. I like to start with weather, because that's going to establish where types of trees are. That's going to start to lay out based on if you know that you always have a front that comes down like this, but there's a mountain range. That means you're going to have a more temperate zone down here. You're going to have rainforest if you have them here. You're going to have an arid zone on the other side because it's going to drop the water, and it starts to build a logical, realistic basis, which we connect with as the reader. Like, that makes sense. That's how that works. And when you have a consistency and a logic, and this is not just in your geography, but also in your magic, in your economic factors. When you have those things, and those are all lore things, that makes your setting real.
So let me give you an example there. Dragonlance, when we started in on it, we had time before we got into the design itself. Tracy drew a map of Ancelon of Krynn, and basically laid everything out. And then he dropped a rock on Istar and changed everything, and it became the Sea of Blood, and you had that whirlpool in the center because we ultimately wanted that cool image of the whirlpool, and basically the eastern half of the continent was devastated by this attack, and that in turn from the map created the whole idea of Istar getting above itself and the gods basically punishing it with a big asteroid hit. So basically, that the maps tend to influence what we're doing in the game itself. Now, by the same token, one of the very earliest published worlds, the known world of D&D, from the red box and everything, that was more of a happenstance map. In other words, I want to have the Arabian cultures here, and I want to have the Viking cultures right here, and I want to have the magic user dominated area right here, and they're all right next to each other. So when we eventually put all the maps together, we discovered we had a river that started 10 miles from one coast and then went through a mountain range and all the way down to a bay down on the opposite side of the landmass. And it was something we discovered. It's something we learned about that. But one of the points with the known world, one of the core concepts, was the idea that we had a lot of different cultures relatively in place. So that was basically part of the creation. One thing Hasbro used to say about was core ethos. What is, get the idea of the game or the comic or the novel, you do your elevator pitch. G.I. Joe is the greatest American hero. Pokemon has got to catch 'em all. Very early Magic was fortune favors a prepared mind. And they put that on some sales stuff. Yeah. Nobody ever talks about that anymore. By the time I got there,
that was when I was.
That was when,
that's our era right there.
But it sums up the gameplay, but also how that affects the world. So our heroes and our protagonists, who are you when you're playing Magic? You're a wizard. You're a planeswalker. But basically, it's because you are planning and you have prepared a deck, and basically fortune, as far as it's a random draw from it. So therefore, you basically come up with what you want to do out of that, and the game affects the world itself. Game ethos is affected by the world is affected by the game ethos.
And I like how you said how these areas defined the culture. And as for me, I don't write fantasy. I mean, I do, but it's not my baby. I'm a hard sci-fi girl, so it's very geopolitical. So you talked about where you start as opposed to starting in the map. I start in that geopolitical history. So when you read my sci-fi, I actually have 2 timelines. I'm like, here's the timeline we're living in, but here's the stuff that happened before it happened geopolitically to put us here. And that's part of the lore, that history that you build up, and you show the reality of, in my case, I write human science fiction. So you show the reality of human conflict, and it kind of continues to play out, and how things start. And they usually start from a very idyllic place. And what broke it? What broke it? Because it'll break, because we're humans, we do that. So what broke it? And now we have we end up with a factional kind of an iteration that comes as you build out your world, and you get that geopolitical history. You understand the relationships, the interplay between different elements of a story, and that interplay is what's going to drive that story forward.
And the world cannot necessarily dominate the story itself. Ultimately, it's your protagonist within the novel, your player characters within an RPG, the art and appearance for Magic the Gathering, that sort of thing, all basically have to take ultimately the first place. And the lore itself is this background. There are people who are the lore hounds who love to check everything out and make sure it all coordinates. Elder Scrolls Online, we have an online wiki that's a fan piece, and we're often checking against it to see what we've done years and years before. We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary. Okay, we're using this character. Where did they appear? What did they do? What was their voice like? All of that is very useful because we create a continuous story and a continuous world, and sometimes we'll change things. Things will alter. We'll basically come up with something, and ooh, that's a great idea. Can we work it in? Can we fit it in? A creature you haven't seen before, a god that has never appeared. Well, where was it? Where is it going? How are we going to? Are we changing the world?
And if a character changes, what was the thing that made them change? Exactly. Does it make sense so that because the fans are going to be the first ones to call you out when you mess it up. Don't get me wrong, but So when you go to that wiki,
Yep.
like somebody can go, wait a minute, this is weird. But then if they look back at it, they go, oh, but because this happened.
And one of the things with Elder Scrolls and our big fantasy worlds is there are so many creatives adding into it and contributing and growing the product and basically making it cooler over time. So coordinating it for the first couple of years of the Forgotten Realms with Ed, I was the traffic cop. I was the guy in the office, and basically we had a map hanging on the wall, and Doug was over here working in the moonshays, and Bob was up in the north in the spine of the world, and everybody had like a little bit of turf, and just coordinating it was one of the major things. One of the rules I had was don't blow up the moon. And I had two very good writers who tried to blow up the moon as the big moment at the end of their adventure. And they basically we backed them off on that, but we did have made major changes over time. The Avatar Crisis, but basically that's an act of volition as opposed to just we're making stuff up. So, do you take questions?
We're going to take some questions at the end.
On the moon explosion, you made fun of that in that joke issue of Forgotten Realms.
Yes.
When they go behind the scenes, there's someone
Yes.
on the phone behind saying, "No, you can't go up the moon on it."
Exactly.
I love that.
It was an inside joke in film.
That
There you
issue
go.
was filled with inside jokes. The TSR artists were there. A lot of the designers were there. Jim Ward was there. Basically, we Kim Mohan showed up, and basically, the conceit was, well, this is what's going on behind the scenes of the realms as we're arguing. And I appear there with Jim Lauder, who is one of our book editors for the Forgotten Realms, and we're sitting there very tired, and Elminster is lecturing us on Mulhorand pottery. And you can see this is from the 8th Dynasty because, that's got the ridge lines along the side. And Jim says, hang on, Jeff, I got to get another tape again. So,
I love that.
That's
So
very detailed lore when you're getting into
It is,
and I
was
archaeology of it.
yeah, that's made up on the fly.
Yeah.
We would know that, Mulhorand was an ancient society. Yes, it makes sense for them to have pottery. No, we're not putting that down anywhere where we're going to have to worry about it.
So you talk about don't blow up the moon, but there are a lot of things we can do, and I want to toss this one over to you, Chris. You've written in a lot of IPs that you're just basically giving the lore. You and I just both worked on
Yeah.
Goodnack with Ed recently, and when you're just looking at the lore, how are you drawn to where the stories are in the lore? What do you do?
Well, and the whole thing is crazy. So, like with the Goodnack one, they let us write the lore. They're like,
I know.
hey, we have the stuff.
was
Can
kind
you
of
guys
fun.
go back? We need authors that know how to do that and make all the crap up for us. So we started working on that. I picked up probably about 5-6 years ago, back in the 90s, Dragon Dice, right? So the World of Espa, which is a Lester Smith game. He had a lot of lore, and he had some books, and he had some short stories, and lore was sprinkled narratively throughout, like the rules books, and then like the Dice Commander's Manual. I had to go back and read all those and compile a document so that I had a series Bible when this was handed off. And then we also tried to play homage to as much of the fan stuff that was out there that maybe made sense and fit. So we took some of those things and kind of incorporated those into the novel series going forward, because sometimes the fans have the best stuff. Like you guys are playing with our toys, but you guys have the best toys creatively. So sometimes we borrow from those. And I wound up building out about 100-page book series, taking a lot of those where the locations are, then going, having a map done, though, because they had never had a high quality map. There was a couple of novels at that point, some novellas, and then the rest. And like, we know generally where they are, but let's put a graphic representation down. We're building up the world, because we come to a point where there was stuff out there, but now for it to go forward in a professional manner, we need to be professional. We need to have all of these things in place so that we can focus on the plot and narrative, because the lore is done. We know what the things are. We know what we have, the 5 gods that created the things, and then kind of the greater gods beyond that. And once you have that listed out hierarchically, and you know how it works, and that's all very mechanical and kind of boring from the reader's perspective, unless you're just a lore nerd. But once you have those, now it's just here's the system. Now just work the system.
Now, that's an interesting thing because we get a lot of fandom input as well, and we try to resist it, actually, as far as we don't want to take other people's ideas. We don't want to lift stuff out of there. So when we're working with an online wiki, for example, we double check.
Yeah.
Basically, we use that as a foundation, but then we make sure that this is what we go into the game. Is this what they really said? Is this someone's fandom, extrapolation of it? Does it make sense? But we do try to avoid actually, taking stuff from an art side. We had some tattoos that showed up for our characters, which were really nice looking. They turned out they were created by someone online.
Oh.
And so we had to back up and strip them out, put something else in there that was as cool or cooler.
Right.
But we tried to basically, respect the rights and abilities of everybody else involved.
Well, like we're talking core ethos. So this specific world was purchased from TSR from WotC after the merger by a group of fans. So part of their core ethos was that we have a strong fandom and community tie-in with that. So which is
what was the world for this?
ESPA. So
it's the Dragon Dice one. Okay, excellent.
Yeah, so not everyone is like that. So you have to know.
But the fans purchased.
Yes.
They basically got that back in a phase. So basically, they became the controlling entity for it.
Well,
cool.
the entity that is there that for the shareholders, but because of that, because they all came out of the fandom, they have a strong tie then.
And there's a strong history. And that's one of the things that we have in shared worlds is that we have, the original creator may have moved on to other things. The people who created wonderful things for it, they may have gone on to other projects. So basically keeping an eye toward your own lore and your own history as you build history is one of the challenges creatively, particularly as worlds become much more successful and people, I'm watching the D&D movie. I'm hitting the checklist. Okay, we mentioned that. We mentioned Fort Stray. That's nice. Basically, it's got that Leo DiCaprio moment where you point at the screen and go, "Yeah, I recognize that offhand remark."
So let's talk about some of that history that's built that has a legacy, and we've all worked in other IPs before where that legacy, that intellectual property, somebody called me out in one of the things for not saying that, where there's some of these rules that exist, some of this lore that exists in a legacy property go back 50, 60, 70, even more years, in which case some of our reality has changed. I shouldn't say our reality. It's like do the best you can, and when you know better, do better kind of thing. So some of the things that might have been lore, might have been legacy, that are no longer acceptable by today's standards, how do you correct them in the lore through the new stories and new creation without dishonoring them?
I think we accommodate. I think we basically recognize that we may have had problematic materials from 30 years ago, and basically, okay, how do we address them? How do we change them? A story from 30 some years ago was Ed Greenwood turning over his Forgotten Realms. He sent huge bushels of reams of paper with his notes and basically the drawings. We turned that into the first grade box, and we had the artist do his maps for cities like Arabelle and Shadowdale and everything. And in those maps, and all along, he sent the map tag files. There were a number of brothels, bordellos, seraglios, a whole collection of them. So, we had the question, we could either eliminate the buildings, which means we'd have to redo the map tags, which would be a nightmare from a production end, or we found another name for all of those types of buildings. And that's where fest halls came from, which is now a feature within a lot of fantasy, where basically we're heading for the fest halls, okay? And that expanded out in definition to more opulent pleasure palaces with fine food and spas and cucumbers over your eyes and all the rest of that, and including what he had originally, because that changed over time. And that was that's one of the things you can do at the beginning of an IP. You can basically move things around in the maps. The Moonshays were originally more of an Earthsea type archipelago, but Doug Niles was working on a British type novel, a Celtic novel, and so we pulled out the Moonshays we put in the Moonshays that Doug had, and that basically created his world. So again, this was a combination of a lot of people. We drained part of the Great Glacier, and we had at the time we were giving pieces of it away for like CompuServe and AOL to basically set adventures there. So we had everything divvied up and everything basically. And as you moved into other people's territories, we wanted to make sure that they were aware people were coming in. So
I like that you talked about, you used these inspirations from multiple places, and I want to kind of toss that over to you, Chris. You had a trading card game that did very well last year on Kickstarter, Call of Cthulhu, and you're like, Cthulhu, and now Winnie the Pooh is in the public domain. So how exactly did you say, you know what, here are some things I'm gonna create? You created a trading card game with that. So you had to kind of create your own lore around that. Just kind of what was some of the process for putting that together from a creative and narrative perspective?
So it's weird because I really didn't have a process. I describe as how I came up with it. I was lifting weights. It was leg day. I was doing, I think, deadlifts, and I think I had a minor stroke, pulling like 500 plus pounds. Like, Call of Cthulhu. I'm like, that sounds excellent. And literally all like came to me in an instant. But I grew up. I grew up on some of those IPs, reading the books and stuff, and just really, really loved. Really not even necessarily the main characters who were in there, but a lot of the weird little things about it, as well as kind of the story, the backstory of the Milne family, which is really more of a tragedy than anything else. I think the story of Alan Milne and his literary empire is maybe more interesting than all the kids stuff. And maybe that's because I'm older now and beyond the kids, the scope of the kids stuff. But just had a lot of fun with this. So it wasn't necessarily the pre-planning, but you probably could have done a lot of pre-planning to figure those things out, where you're like, what do I have access to? What's allowed? Like we had to wait on a certain timeline for it. Like Tigger didn't come to public domain until much later than the rest of the books, because he wasn't in the original books that were released by Alan. So just having to learn, and sometimes you got to math some of these things out. But then harnessing the things that people like, and people like there's shared fandoms that are out there everywhere. And we all know that because we're here, but we all like certain things. We tend to connect across aisles, across camps, across factions with the things we have in common. And that's a unifying thing all across humanity, where we all have certain things in common, whether you're separated by languages, whether you're separated by locations, by politics, by wealth levels, by all these different things. We all love D&D. We all love fantasy, and so we probably also love Tolkien. We also love these things, and we can find that commonality. And so when you find those things that are really common, that you have inspiration on, you can start riffing on that. Like, why do I love it? What do I love about it? And those are general high-level concepts where you can start building your own world. You can start homebrewing your own, whether it's a campaign, whether it's a system, whether it's a card game, or a comic book, or a webtoons type of a thing. Like, dwell in that space, in that commonality, and you're going to find that people are probably going to love a lot of the same things. Maybe not the exact way you love it, but there's enough commonality there that you can build upon that.
Thanks. What about starting from scratch? Oh, unless you had something to add.
No. I was going back to something that you were saying at the time about how we evolve, and basically handling material that could have been questionable. As we go forward. Lovecraft, we talked about.
Yes.
Is an excellent example, both because he had a lot of racist materials, but he also used fear of the other as his one of his core concepts when he was writing. And as we've moved forward with the various editions and with the card games and everything else, we basically have sort of redefined otherness into all of us. And basically keeping that fear of the supernatural, the other, the weirdness, but no longer. He had a thing against the Portuguese.
Amongst many other
things. Particularly, that's the one that weirds people out, because the Rhode Island area had a strong Portuguese community that grew up there. And so he basically did not like them. So you'll often find that sudden, offhand comment against people from Portugal. So, okay,
I've read some of those. Like, where did that come from? Then it passes. gone.
Yeah,
It's like,
exactly. It's because where he was.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
it
and the
was
other very Lovecraftian thing is that you talked about earlier. You're like the world can't necessarily. The world isn't the story. Your player characters drive the
Exactly.
story. Your characters drive.
And if you're
And Lovecraft was all like it was world. It was world. It was
Mhm.
like monsters and worlds and all this stuff. And so don't use that as your inspiration for building out your characters. And the people groups
Mhm.
need to be. They didn't used to be when people built out the lore of a world. They didn't necessarily used to build out the people groups
Mhm.
as part of the lore. And today, I can't imagine building out fiction without building out some element of how the people groups came to believe and behave in the ways that they do. And that's part of
we
it
see
today.
some of that, people who harness that well, like George R. R. Martin, where
Right.
all of the
Mhm.
first few books, you didn't really see any people from Dorne, but we're always talking about
Yeah.
them, and then we see them later on when they come into the picture.
I did a project. It was a very short one for TSR, and then Wizard of the Coast, called Jakandor. And what we did is we did 3 projects. And the first one, your protagonist, you were playing these barbarian immigrants from over the seas, and you basically had a high sense of honor and magical totem mechs that you drove around, and you're on the eastern half of the island. On the western half of the island, and you're the heroes. And on the western half of the island, there's an elder civilization of necromancers who have used necromancy as far, they have the skeletons, toiling in the field. They basically have all sorts of magic. So it's fighters and magic users. And they're the heroes. And then in the third project, we brought them together. So basically, you could choose a side for it. So we basically had diverse cultures
I love that.
in competition without leaning one way or the other.
Yeah, writing that like you said, instead of going from othering, we're going to all of us.
Yes.
And even like when you're building out the villainous cultures or the anti-hero cultures, antagonist cultures within your lore, nobody is all bad or all good. And building out those, redeeming qualities, not just as an individual when you're creating characters, but as a culture. And I'm going to go to a very, very real life thing. Like let's talk, post 9/11. So I was an Arabic linguist in the military. So I've like was in all of that stuff. And there was like around our country, I mean, the people who taught me to speak Arabic were all native Arab peoples who came to this country for various refugee statuses and were America loving, beautiful souled human beings who I had relationships with. And post 9/11, it was like, you're all this way and you all believe this thing. And there was no a broad understanding of the culture around, even if you don't necessarily agree with maybe some of their religious beliefs or whatnot, when you understand the depth of that and some of that meaning of it and the layers of it, you're like, oh, you're no longer other, you're now us. And we do that in our books. And I think sci-fi has been terrible. I'm a huge sci-fi girl, don't get me wrong, but like every Klingon is a warrior, and every
But actually,
with
that's
the-
a great example
Yeah.
of evolution over time. The Klingons, as they originally were portrayed, were Russian.
Mhm.
Yes,
they
that's
were
true.
basically presented as the opponents, the foes, and they were basically, they had Slavic names, and their
Mhm.
women were beautiful and alluring. Their men were, warlike, and basically had facial hair,
and orange skin and not the ridges.
Yeah, not the ridges. And as they move forward, they evolved such that you know more and more about Klingon culture, and some of it comes from the fandom, the Klingon
Yeah.
diplomatic corps back in those days. Before there were stormtroopers, the security people would dress up like Klingons,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
It just with toe socks, they just like. But they had. You basically, it softens and you understand and you comprehend and you basically bring them in, and so you have Worf on the deck of the Enterprise
Yeah.
D, and suddenly they're no longer the enemy just because they're Klingons. They may be the opponent because what they want is not what you want.
Mhm.
So that's a good way of watching that
Yeah.
evolution. Drow, in the
Yeah.
Forgotten Realms in the
Yes.
D&D session. I mean, they were originally presented as this exotic underground race, evil, 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 and over time, Dritz and the others basically have, humanized them because we want to know more about these cultures. We want to know more about the Klingons. And basically, as we learn, we basically, they stop being like an omnipresent enemy and become more of a group of individuals. And that's one of the cool things about evolving your lore over time.
Yeah.
Well, I will never forget watching that episode of TNG where they've got they're going back in time and they're green screen over.
Yes,
and
the old.
Worf looks over at the other Klingons and goes, it was an awkward time. And,
We don't like to talk about that.
we do
That's
not
something
speak of
like
such
that.
things.
Yes, that's what it
That's
is.
a
That's
lot.
what it is. That was a great moment. That was a great moment. But yeah,
I had an old lore explanation for it and was going to write a novel involving all the doctors from the different times. Because, the Klingons arrived, and because they were exposed to the humans, they basically, had a virus. They got rid of the head bumps. So.
Oh, how interesting.
I think I've read some. I don't know if that was fan work or if that was an actual lore
story.
Yeah, I think it might be.
It might be
correct me
official
if I'm
lore.
wrong.
Who knows
I
if
think
it became
is.
canon or not?
Yeah.
So.
But the stuff, that sort of thing, evolves and was one of the challenges that basically could.
Actually, they filled it in just like that.
Yeah, I think that's what it was.
So you talk about the fact that you're humanizing, and I think that's what in fantasy, a lot of times it was what people were doing, even back to Tolkien, they were taking and they were using these other races of non-human beings to basically encapsulate a specific human culture that was being othered.
Right.
And really we're all, if not in today when we're looking at, we're all humans, except for the AI bots, we're all humans.
Give them time.
Yeah. And so really that's who we're going to relate to better as a character is humans. So you have to humanize. You have
Yes,
to bring
because your readers are human, your players are human, your bosses are human, really. So basically reaching out to them basically and making them accessible so they find what makes the heroes work is a commonality between between the character and the reader or player. Frodo is gentry British. He's got gardeners. He has a very comfortable life. He's upper middle class, but because of who he is, we connect with him and we're rooting for him. But the Shire is a very British sort of place, a very modern British place, as opposed to where we find in the human kingdoms elsewhere, where they often look at the halflings and say, "Oh, you're odd. We've heard old legends about you."
Yeah.
Not all of them good.
So I want to leave. We've got like 10, 15 minutes because this is such a broad topic.
Yeah.
I wanted to leave a lot of space for you guys to just bring your questions to us. So really, lore, all of it, everything, where lore is related to science fiction, fantasy, gameplay, how we use it, how we build it. The floor is kind of yours for a little bit of questioning here.
When you're developing a world and you decide to focus in a specific area, and then as you're focused on that, then things happen. Maybe you're running a campaign and you're inspired by things that happened there, and you decide, you know what? I think I have some ideas for how we got here.
Yes.
And then you go back. How do you put all that together in a way that the readers can digest without feeling like they've just been flipped on their heads?
Oh, sorry, you sounded like you had an answer, but if I don't want to make it.
I was just rearing up to be able like a dragon. Depends on the project, but it's a good example of show as opposed to tell. One of the things that Tolkien did that has had the effect on role-playing games is we had a whole 50 pages at the beginning of Lord of the Rings explaining the story so far, and then at the end, the appendices, we had like 10 different appendices talking about family trees and all of he was showing his work. And I think that effect has an effect on modern authors in the fact that we can do that as well. But you do have very accessible fantasies. It's the idea that your character is often your voice and your eyes in the world, and so you can basically show the world through that, and you can back up and say this is what's happened before. There's the third, fourth chapter of Lord of the Rings, The Shadow of the Past, basically is nothing but info dump, as Gandalf explains, why you have the ring, and this is just and it was a big block of text, but it worked very well as setting everything up for the players itself. It better is the idea was you encounter and you get bits and pieces as you go forward.
So I've got two little things on that. One is you talked about the info dump chapter. The sixth book of the Harry Potter series. The entire book is an info dump, and they do it through the pensieve. And honestly, like, I think the lesson that you have there, I think pretty universally everybody agrees it's their least favorite book in the series. And the lesson there from her, regardless of what you think about her politics, her writing, the lesson is that she already had you. So make sure that you're not like throwing that at your readers right away. Like here, she's like, you are in love. You want to know more. And then you just, by the time you get to that sixth book, no matter what you think about it, you're like, I'm going to push through this because I need to know how this turns out. And she was as creative as she could be in that, sharing.
The first 5 books, I think, is a good example of what we're talking about, in the fact that basically you have your main character who is an alien to this wizardly world. And basically as he learns things, you're learning things and you're understanding why things are happening, and basically you're getting the backstory. So I think that's one of the advantages when you've got the space of a novel to do so. You don't necessarily have to info dump. It sometimes works, but it's a very risky tactic.
So I got a great piece of advice from Stephen Bruce, who writes a lot of stuff in Tor. I've done a couple of world building seminars together, and he always says this. He says, you as the author should know more than you're revealing to the reader. So you want to build that's all back end system stuff.
Yes.
And then you sprinkle that where it's most relevant. You need people to know that there's a cohesive connection, but you don't have to open up the fire hose. You probably shouldn't.
And a little bit of ledger domain. You don't necessarily know what's happening here, but this is cool. We're going to play with it. We were talking about the Avatar crisis and blowing up the moon. One of the authors did try to blow up the moon at the end of the Avatar crisis. And instead, he basically had the god that threw all the other gods out, and basically over god Ao. Basically, the last line of the story was, and then he went to report to his gods. So suddenly, now, because of that one line, we have tiers of gods in the Forgotten Realms and more area for people to expand out into.
I love that. Go ahead.
Rory.
Go off on that a little bit. In ESO, we actually do 2 little board tricks. One is kind of like you were saying, obscurity.
Yes.
Like we just don't say what's going on. But we also have a lot of unreliable narratives.
Yes. That's a wonderful key for us.
From the player's perspective, you're talking to people and they don't necessarily know, but they're trying to tell you their story about the war.
If
we
you
always leave ourselves a lot of massage room there.
If your speaker is Altmer, is High Elven, you're going to basically, they're going to have a different viewpoint necessarily than the Dark Elves, for example. So therefore, you can get the feeling and the vibe, and it creates a richness and a life to give the readers multiple sources. So you don't necessarily, and if you're going to say, one thing, you maybe later on want to say something different, a different viewpoint of it on the same subject matter. Exactly.
My question though was for Chris. Great to talk to you yesterday. And I like that you worked across so many different genres, and I was curious what you take from one genre to another as sort of a core or an inspiration, and what you try to keep separate, like between them.
There are many things I do try to keep separate. Do you want to sum up his question? I don't think he's probably.
Just that for the video. When you're working cross genre, what elements do you kind of keep separate, and what do you keep core in your specific writing approach?
So I keep some of the things that are really very trope specific. aside. I try not to intermix the fan. Like nobody loves to get to the end of the story and you find out that all the magic spells you cast are actually a spaceship out in space causing the things down in your fan. Like you don't want to dishonor like all of the tropes and all of the universe and the standard pieces of that world. Now you can do it, but you're going to piss a lot of people off.
Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe does
Yes.
this all the bloody time. He shows, he does not explain, and you're reading, oh, wait, they're on a spaceship. I understand that it's been a fantasy story all along,
Yep.
but he's on a spaceship, and you're basically dealing with time dilation or basically weightlessness. Okay, now I think I understand what he's saying.
If you're doing that, and
and he does that on purpose.
You can be, once you start doing that, you probably have to make that your main thing because now nobody trusts you to write the genre that you're in. Because it's not that you have an unreliable narrator, it's now that you're an unreliable author. And so you've got to make sure that you're not falling into that category. But like for me, I write books that I think I would like to read. I love fantasy. I love sci-fi. I love some horror stuff. I love my comedy stuff. I keep them as separate as I can, but when I can find those overlap areas where it logically makes sense, where I'm no longer an unreliable author, then I will sometimes pull those things in. Like, for instance, if you're writing fantasy and you really want to add like some sci-fi components, you can pull in something that's clockwork.
Gnomes. Dragonlance.
Gnomes, yeah. You pull in the artificers, and you pull in those things where you can have some hypertech, but it's now maybe a little bit related. It's very specifically nuanced to a species, a race, a faction. So you can use those without disrupting the whole of the genre. Otherwise, you become Gene Wolfe.
Yeah, and we talk about evolution and basically moving forward. The introduction of clockwork, steampunk, etc., into fantasy. Going back to the early days of D&D, we stayed away from guns. We stayed away from, basically steamwork and that sort of thing. We stayed much more. And as time has gone by, we've added more and more with gnomes and clockwork. And, it's a cool evolution to watch.
And I love the crossover.
Well,
Like,
and
that's the
steampunk
space that
is
I live in.
really, it is that road. It's the fence between sci-fi and fantasy. It's like they meet in steampunk.
Yeah.
That's where they come together.
But ultimately, the game or the novel has to rule. I wrote a short story for Guild Wars 2 where we introduced guns as a regular thing of the whole process of loading a gun and the process of basically, and we're talking about musketry as far as that point, basically pouring the gunpowder in and basically putting in the wadding and putting in the ball and basically, our animators basically, you're shooting the gun. And it's rapid fire. You got a musket. It looks like a musket, but you're carrying out like this. So that is the truth within the game, as opposed to what I had written. So.
Do you feel like there's a connective tissue between like comedy and fantasy?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, look at things like what's the big one?
Douglas Adams.
Well, Douglas Adams is one. That'd be the comedy and the sci-fi. You get The Color of Magic. Which is
Tolkien. Basically, when he's operating in the Shire, he's basically being satiric on that cultured British life.
What's that called? Those the something about the it was a fantasy happens in a I forget. I don't want to talk on that. Okay. But yeah, there is all like comedy fantasy that is cozy. Like is a big movement in the genre right now.
Right.
Like the stakes of the world. No. I just got a pissed off bar patron who really needs to get his grog right now, and that's the whole. The stakes are low, and yet it's fun. It's cozy. You're probably thinking of the story right now, like the name.
No.
It's like,
we were reading something. Rory here, by the way, works as a content designer for Elder Scrolls Online. But our book club had a cozy book, in which the protagonist was a herbalist, and basically, she was forced to deal with magicians. She usually provides all the spell components that they use, and things go radically astray, and now she's called upon to basically fix everything as far as that's concerned. Well, and that's a good example of a cozy type thing, where you're not taking the standard swashbuckling hero and basically instead of having this person who's always worked behind the counter, greengrocer, but wants to experience
Well, I think there's two really big things I think that are culturally we're experiencing right now. One is we're tired of the high stakes of always experiencing the next apocalypse. And so I think we're a little burned out in our real lives. And so we want to read about the cozy, as well as I think with so many video games and things that have been out there that have the NPCs, you're like, that is such an interesting NPC. I want to know their background. And that's the obscurity piece. We have not known that. And now I think we're seeing that cozy movement, low stakes. I just want to live in the Shire a little while. And I think we're loving that.
Well, it's so I write these dark apocalyptic things, but I honestly, but I'm ultimately an optimist. Anybody who knows me in real life, then they read my books and they're like, oh, really? But I think it's just that tone. It's going to be, all of that stuff is always going to exist. There's going to be people who want to live in the dark because it's a little bit more cathartic, and then see how we come out of it. There are going to be people who are like, you know what, I live in the dark every day. I want to live in the light when I'm reading my books. And I think both of them have a place. And so they have a place, whether it's fantasy, whether it's science fiction, whether it's that steampunk in between over there. And it's going to be whatever our audience wants to read that thing. I think they all have homes.
And there are also tools that we can use when we're writing, as far as we can have those lighter moments. We can have the comedy. We can basically poke fun at bureaucracy or, stuffiness or whatever, and basically slide into that dark area where they're exploring the underground and danger is all around. And basically any move could be your last. And basically that creates a rhythm within what you're writing, as far as, and also potential for the players within an RPG.
Absolutely. And it's the human condition. I mean, it's all present. So we probably have time for just one more question. Who's got it for us here?
Anyone? Bueller?
All right, to the back.
So I really like your work on the Forgotten Realms comic, but they kind of wrapped up the whole thing fast. And I remember that it was because TSR and DC kind of had a falling out for all that.
This is true. Literally, but they... TSR, as it did many times, went into competition with its own licensors. It started doing some comic books on their West Coast. And, DC basically said, okay, well, we aren't going to renew the license. We're going to, basically get to this point when the license runs out, we'll be done. And they called me up and said, Jeff, we want you to give us the plots for the next 8 books, and then we're going to wrap it up. So we got to wrap things up in Forgotten Realms. Spelljammer didn't necessarily get that. It sort of ended, and that was the end of it. That comic that you mentioned, Everyone Wants to Rule the Realms, issue 24, was actually a fill issue that Rags did. So in case everybody else got behind, we could just drop that in to any plot we had and do a humorous issue. So that worked out well for us. But we got to the end of it. I already had my contracts. They said, okay, fine, you got to finish it up, and that's that. But we're done. They go, okay, that's good. So they gave me a break to try to wrap it up fairly securely. But it was simply the fact, and they didn't, storm out and say, no, we're never going to publish comics with you again. It was, they let the license elapse. They did not renew it as a result of our actions.
So as we wrap up, not just this event, but the whole writing track of the weekend, I'm just going to have you say, what is your current project? Where can they find you today, and or beyond today?
Just one project?
Just pick one. Pick one, Christopher.
Okay. All right. She said one, but I'm gonna. So I'm finishing. The very pretty one. If you come down and see the one with all the real fancy pages and the foil, that's the Curse of the Fae Duelist, Human Trapped in the Land of the Fae. Very almost Victorian steampunk, but I call it arcane punk, where you can bottle magic. I'm going to write the next 3 in that over the next 18 months, just to put a book in, because people have been loving it. But I'm really wanting to do that so that I can get to the one that I know I've told you about it. It's the Burbs meets Hot Tub Time Machine meets Barbecue Pitmasters. Real fiction, guys in the cul-de-sac.
It's actually a pretty cool story. We watched through the whole thing. It was awesome.
Yeah. That was actually a part that I was literally sketching this, just riffing on something that would be really interesting in an outlining seminar for our working writers mastermind. And at the end, I'm like, you guys, I think I have to write this book. I'm inspired myself, and I think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
My day job is I am a senior writer for Elder Scrolls Online, and several projects that I've worked on have always seen the light of day. Necrom Gold Road. You can find us online. What we're working on right now, of course, is secret. So, but more cool stuff is coming. We just had a recording session where literally I put the director on the floor laughing from some of the lines that we wrote, which makes me very, very happy.
Exciting. I love
Other than that, I do small stuff, usually for Kobold Publishing, because I got friends over there. Have a blog, grubbstreet.blogspot.com, and actually, for fun, I've been writing plays. I've had a couple readings in the Seattle area, but it's really small-time things.
Yeah. Very cool. I actually have my daughter owns a theater company, and she's putting up a play that I wrote next year.
That's great.
So I go, like I said, I go by Red. So I'm redthecolorwritesbooks.com. So I'm really easy that way. I like Chris, like Jeff, I also have quite a few things in the works at any given time because this is my full-time job. So I'll just tell you, one of the things I didn't think I would get into, and I surprised myself, is Lit RPG. And the thing that I don't love about Lit RPG is because our attention span as readers has gone way, way down, and Lit RPG books are like, they're very, very long. The word count is high. So I'm actually introducing Lit RPG novelettes. So they're nice little short Lit RPG novels. It's going to be called the Infinite Stefania series. And the first one of those is actually going to be in the Origins anthology that you and I are in when we go to Origins. So watch for Infinite Stefania if you want to check out Lit RPG, but not, pony up to 180,000 words.
So how long is a novelette?
A novelette, in my definition, a novelette is going to be about 30. So you're
30,
longer than a short story, but not as long as a novella, which is like going to be in that 50 to 70. And then a novel, some people say 70. I really say a novel's got to be in that 80 to 120.
Right. Your typical old-fashioned TSR novel was like 90K.
Yep. I tend to land around 120. Sorry, y'all. I know I'm long-winded. But yes, this has been the Writer's Track. We thank you for joining us all weekend long, and visit me at the Writer's Mastermind booth.
Have a good last day.
Yes.